Thousands of people walk past them every day, especially on the Appalachian Trail, and they would never know they're there. And they would never know they're different from the redback salamander, which looks very similar. They're almost like hidden gems that are rarely seen, but are super exciting when you do see them.
The Shenandoah salamander lives here in Shenandoah National Park, but it is endangered. Over time, it has been threatened by competition, limited habitat, and especially climate change, reducing its population size. It's a small but incredible amphibian that lives on land, burrows underground much of its life, is nocturnal, is carnivorous, breathes through its skin, and has some amazing adaptations to survive. Today, it's endemic to 3 of the tallest peaks in Shenandoah National Park, meaning that it lives only here and nowhere else in the entire world. It truly is a hidden gem. So what are we doing to protect it?
My job is to understand and protect the natural resources in Shenandoah National Park. So I monitor populations of animals to see where they live and whether their populations are going up and down, and then based on those data, try to develop management options that we can use to help support those populations. So we work with scientists like Evan and Adrian at the US Geological Survey to try to integrate the understanding of populations and their dynamics with the decisions that we make about management. So Evan and Adrian are responsible for collecting data on where Shenandoah salamanders live and whether their populations are increasing or decreasing. And then I try to develop the management options that we can evaluate using the science that they develop and come up with options that are going to be successful.
There's a wonderful partnership between organizations and dedicated, passionate people to help us understand and research this amazing but mysterious creature that calls Shenandoah National Park home. Over time, much has been discovered and understood about the Shenandoah salamander thanks to this research.
So the Park Service specifically asked for help resolving questions they had about the Shenandoah salamander. It's difficult to answer a lot of the questions because they are so rarely seen on the surface. There are maybe 90% of them below ground at any given time. So it takes a lot of effort to think about the difficult questions that they wanted answered. So they asked for USGS help. We started with just figuring out where they currently occur.
Today, we know a lot more, thanks to this research, about when and how to monitor a species that's rather difficult to find.
Most of the time it spends its life underground. When it's on the surface, it's under rocks and logs, and that's how we figure out when we go into our surveying how to find the salamander. It's not that easy to monitor. It's not that easy to find because it's really sensitive to the surface environmental conditions. If it's a little bit windy, it goes underground. If it's a little bit dry, it goes underground. And if it's a little bit too hot, it goes underground. And so those things make it hard to find kind of when you want to look for it.
Over time, questions have evolved to help aid the research of the Shenandoah salamander.
So we started out in 2007. The basic question was, where does the salamander occur? Is it in the same places as it occurred, in the 1980s, 1990s when we last stopped looking for it? So the first set of research was just to figure out the best methods to survey for it, given that we had an expectation of the underground most of the time, given that we didn't know what the extent of its range was and if it had changed over, the intervening 50 or so years. So the first kind of 4 or 5 years we spent in what we thought was a historic range, looking for the salamander, trying to figure out how to find it. So methods development kinds of things. So once we had that sorted, we started to expand the kinds of places that we were looking for it, with this idea that we wanted to better describe the kind of environmental conditions that it could occur in and better describe the extent of its range. And that's important if we're thinking about monitoring or doing research to understand how the species might change in its distribution, what its features, the probability it might go extinct in the future. And given these kinds of threats that we're worried about, climate change, forest defoliators, competition from the native salamander, we wanted to do research that tried to sort all that out.
So one of the main questions is what limits the range of the Shenandoah salamander. Previously, it was thought that the main limiting factor was competition with a similar species, Plethodon cinereus, the red-backed salamander. It turns out that it's probably more complicated than that. In some areas of the range, we found that the most limiting factor is probably moisture in the air, especially at lower elevations as relative humidity changes. And if you spend any time in Shenandoah National Park, especially in the higher elevations, you'll notice how fog clings to the highest elevations. And we think that has a lot to do with where the Shenandoah salamander loves to live.
An animal that is picky about its conditions that it lives in, has a very limited habitat range, is nocturnal, spends much of its time burrowing underground, is about the length of your index finger, and is endangered, so it's extra protected. How would you think to monitor that? And when?
Now, my crew, we use some advanced statistical techniques that allow us to sort out all of that. So if we go out on a really dry day to sample the salamander, we can account for the fact that it's dry, and we didn't actually expect to find it, or we expected a lower chance of finding it because it was dry. The current work that we're doing, there's two parts to it. One is we're continuing this long-term monitoring that we started in 2007, and that's just to keep up the pulse of the populations, to try to understand how, if they're persisting in places where they occurred, and if they're colonizing new places where we didn't find them. So that kind of gives us a sense of the range boundaries and the range extent and the dynamics of populations within that. The other set of research, we're trying to figure out what controls that. And so we have a set of transects that are on what we think is the range edge. And there we're studying the relative humidity and the temperature over the course of a couple of years, and pairing that with intensive surveys of the salamander to try and sort out what's controlling the dynamics of the population, if it, how sensitive they are to these changes in climate. Because it's federally endangered, all our work is done under National Park and Fish and Wildlife Service and state permits. So we have permits anytime we go out to handle a salamander.
Most of our research currently is visiting sites in and around the range. A site is a designated tree, and we run a transect tape out from the tree and flip natural cover to search for salamanders. That tells us whether they are on the surface, and over the course of our 6 visits during the year, that tells us whether or not we think the salamanders are actually present there.
Most of the research I do is out in the field, which means that we go outside and we lay down meter tapes out in the woods, and we turn over rocks and logs and look for the salamander, count how many we find, look at their condition, see if we find gravid females, which means females with eggs, that kind of thing, just to keep a pulse on the status of the populations.
So we annually visit about 150 sites in and around the known range of the salamander. That information is super useful to the park, especially making decisions about things like roads, trails, or infrastructure that people use every day.
We visit the plots that we sample over and over again for multiple years, and that gives us a better idea of whether or not it was absent when we look for it, or whether it was just underground and hiding.
I mentioned before that salamanders are not always on the surface. A lot of them are below ground. So at any given time, any given visit, we are not as likely to find them as you might think. We estimate that the detection probability, which is how likely you are to catch a salamander, given that it occurs there, is about 0.4. So maybe 40% of the time, you would find a Shenandoah salamander, when you visit a given site. So it takes several visits to actually confirm or presume that they are present or absent.
Field research is an incredibly important part of understanding what is happening to the current population of Shenandoah salamanders. But what about potential changes that could happen due to its main threat of climate change? How could that be understood?
The work that we do in the lab is we've done some competition studies to see how the Shenandoah salamander interacts with the red-backed salamander under different kind of simulated climate conditions. Try to understand how it might fare in the future if it does get drier and hotter. We take all of that information and like I said, we put it in these kind of advanced statistical models, and we use those to make projections about the fate of the salmon in the future, given different kind of scenarios of how what we think the future might look like.
The Shenandoah salamander and its habitat is automatically protected by being in a national park. But what does the National Park Service do to protect it? What would you do if you were part of the management team here in Shenandoah National Park?
The things that we've done to protect the Shenandoah salamander so far have mostly been related to reducing the impacts of visitors and park operations on the habitat. So there are trails that go through Shenandoah salamander habitat. There are some beautiful views. They live at the top of mountains, so those are nice places to visit. And there also is park infrastructure that is adjacent to Shenandoah salamander habitat. And so the things that we've done so far are trying to limit the impact of park operations to make sure that we're not having a negative impact on the species. And we have also rerouted some trails, banned firewood collection and camping within Shenandoah salamander habitat to try to reduce the impact of hundreds of thousands of people traveling through their habitat. And we are also planning for some more active management in the future. So those things are mostly related to reducing harm, right? So the other option is to do good, to actually actively try to support the populations.
Our research is ongoing. We are currently in the middle of a conversation with the Park Service about what management for this species might look like. Our research directly informs what that management decision or action might be. There are several options. Most are focused on ameliorating the effects of climate change, particularly moisture in the forests.
So the research that U.S. Geological Survey has done on the salamander has given us a much deeper understanding of even just where the salamanders are, and so that we can make sure that we're protecting them and protecting the habitat that's relevant for them. And it also has helped us develop the management strategy. So USGS actually led some workshops to think about the state of the science and brainstorm management options. And they are developing mathematical models that will actually predict the outcomes of those management strategies. Some options include rerouting springs to try to keep the humidity or the soil moisture up in certain areas, or planting trees that provide additional shade to try to reduce the sunlight that gets through and raises temperatures. And so those are the kinds of things that we're exploring, and we haven't implemented them yet, but we are in the process of developing some plans. The other major stressor for the Shenandoah salamander is competition with the redback salamander, which is a very common species across the entire Northeast. And so one option is for us to actually actively remove the redback salamander from adjacent habitat to the Shenandoah salamander and just move them down the mountain or move them to a new location so that that competition is reduced. And so we collaborate and have conversations to try to develop those models, and then eventually we will be able to make decisions based on the predictions that they're making with the data that they collect.
Climate change affects more than just Shenandoah National Park and the Shenandoah salamander. It's around the world. People can have an impact too, no matter where they are.
So there are a couple things that people can do to try to support the Shenandoah salamander populations. One, the biggest stressor that we're expecting in the future is climate change. And so anything that people can do to reduce carbon emissions and limit the increases in temperature that we're expecting with climate change is going to help conserve the Shenandoah salamander. And another thing that people can do to help conserve the Shenandoah salamander is that when you visit Shenandoah National Park, you can just be respectful of the surrounding environment. So, there are salamanders under some of the rocks, and you may think that, it's not that big a deal to turn over a rock and look at a salamander. But when you do that, often they will retreat underground, and it may be for a couple of weeks. And so that's an opportunity for them to feed that they've then lost because somebody turned that rock over and was curious. So stay on the trail and be respectful of the habitats that are around you in these national parks.
Being an individual, it's hard to think about what you can do to help the salamander and help the habitat. Go back to the question about how do you become a scientist, or what makes a good scientist? And it's being curious and being investigative. And so if you're interested in the habitat, you're interested in the environment, you're interested in the salamander, ask lots of questions. learn more, tell people about the habitat in the salamander. Because the more that we know about these things, the more likely we are to make choices that help to maintain the conditions under which the salamander can survive.
So what does the future of our little friend, the Shenandoah salamander, look like?
We are just starting to see the effects of climate change here at Shenandoah, and so we have not taken drastic actions to try to reduce its effects. But we are undertaking some planning processes to try to develop strategies for how to react when that time comes, and it is coming soon. And so one of the examples of that is for the Shenandoah salamander. We do expect that the suitable habitat area is going to shrink over time, and so we're exploring options for how to address that. I'm optimistic that we can sustain the Shenandoah salamander here at the park for a long time to come. You know, the modeling work that US Geological Survey has done suggests that we're not expecting them to be at huge risk for at least several decades. And so we have some time to develop effective management strategies to sustain them in their current habitat. Is that habitat going to shrink? Probably. We're probably just not going to be able to manage the entire current range of the salamander. But you know, under the Endangered Species Act, our responsibility is to try to sustain the species forever, and that's the same as our mission here at the Park Service. And so that's what we're going to try to do. And I'm optimistic that there are places that are still going to be suitable for the Shenandoah salamander for a long time to come.